Good morning. On behalf of the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes Administrator Group, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, Putting Operations into Action During COVID-19. A special thank you to Joe Schwimmer for coordinating this webinar and to our panelists, Bob Dannals, Joni Huerta, Lori Casalonis, George Plews, and Todd Relu, Sean Ryan, and unfortunately, Robert Sokol was called away and won't be able to join us for this meeting. At this time, I'm going to invite Father Bob Dannals to open us with a prayer.
Welcome, everybody. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Oh God, we call upon your grace and healing during this period when we're all working hard to advance your churches. We thank you for, especially this morning, for those who serve in parish administration, those who look after employees and all of the welfare of our congregations. We ask you to give us a measure of resources and strength, patience, and deep reservoirs of love as we take on these new realities. Give each of us a sense of your presence today and always, that what we do and what we say are consistent with your will and advance your love for the sake of the world. Especially during this Holy Week, we remember your Son's self-offering of love. May we be part of that and imitating his love in all that we do and say through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. At this time, I'm going to invite Father Bob to be our first presenter. Father Bob is the Senior Priest Associate at St. John's Cathedral in Jacksonville, Florida.
Great to be with you today. I understand some of you were on a webinar last week, and as all of us are aware, this is an unfolding nature and this new reality. And they've asked me today to speak to the pastoral care of staff members. And I've tried to draw from the reservoir I've had over many years of serving large staffs, but now particularly those of you who are parish administrators, and maybe there's rectors and deans who've joined us this morning as well, looking after as a leader then the welfare and care of our staff. I jotted some things down as I was asked to address the pastoral care of staff members, especially now during the pandemic. So bear with me as I go through some notes that I just jotted down. This didn't come out of any blueprint. It just came out of looking after staffs over now 40 years of ordained ministry. First, I think it's important, especially now, that the rector and the dean and the vestry, and by extension, the congregation, emphasize that the staff is the number one resource of the congregation. The staff needs to hear that in fairly clear terms from the dean or the rector, and certainly from you as the parish administrator, that they are in fact the number one resource of the congregation. And it's really nice if the vestry goes online and says the same thing. We've done that here at St. John's. The vestry and the dean have said this to the staff in the last week. We've written to the staff, and in a Zoom meeting, we've also reiterated that they are the number one resource, and as best we can, the vestry and the dean, are determined to hold on to the whole staff, including as much salary and of course benefits as we can. Many of us have applied for the CARES Act applications during the past week, and so that could also be part of the way that we hold on to our staffs. We're not quite sure how that's going to unfold. We could talk about that, I'm sure, during this webinar. Secondly, let me move through these notes, though. Stay in touch with your staff on a regular basis, both one-on-one and as a group. We still meet on Tuesdays. I imagine many of your congregations are meeting on Zoom or some other method to be together as a staff every week. I try to stay up on behalf of the dean here, one-on-one with staff by calling or texting or emailing at least every other day or so, just to check in on staff, many of whom are working at home. So we can come back to that. A listening ear, of course, trying to have some humor in the middle of this. That's tough sled sometimes, but and certainly assurance and encouragement I've found that encouragement is really the number one piece that people need right now. Some of these are obvious. Third, be clear and timely and caring in all communication. People are on edge these days. Anxiety tends to be soaring a bit more than it normally would. Those of us who are the leaders of the staff need to be clear with our communication, maybe even clearer than we've ever been, and timely. Staff get nervous quickly during this period. And of course, caring in your communication. I've also discovered that our staff here in Jacksonville needs as much consistency and transparency as we can offer to them. So I try to be really consistent, really transparent with all of our staff. Let me click through these. Encourage staff in every way to be a non-anxious presence with the congregation. It's key, of course, that while people's anxieties are soaring, that the staff be a non-anxious presence. Sometimes that would require in some churches, especially if you have a large staff, that you would designate one person to be the voice of calm and reason in the congregation. Usually that's the rector or the dean, but it could be you as the parish administrator or someone like me who's a senior associate trying to help the dean. But someone probably needs to be the official voice. That is, if a parishioner gets really over the top and cranky, that some attention needs to be given to that. Next is, this is a time to maybe repurpose some staff members. Some of our staff are overwhelmed. I'll get to that in a minute. Some of them are overemployed right now. We don't use that word, but you know what I mean is 2 or 3 or 4, or maybe more of your staff used to do very important functions day by day, and now they're simply not, those functions don't exist. I mean, like new member ministries welcoming on Sunday morning just, is essentially non-existent right now. So repurposing those staff could be really important, especially if you're trying to hold on to them in a full staffing position where they're receiving their full pay and their benefits. For example, we put our new member ministry person to work last week by making 1,500 palm crosses. She got a bunch of volunteers. They all made them. They brought them all over to the church with social distancing. Then they packaged all those up and they sent 1,500 Holy Week packs out to the congregation. So you see, we just had to repurpose her. And she felt very significant when the week was over. She had done a good thing. We were very happy with her work. Next, it may be important quietly to come alongside, even when finances are slim and we're wondering how we're going to pay our bills, even as we have that reality, to come along and quietly give a couple bonuses here and there.
We'll figure it out, George. Otherwise, we'll go and figure out what happened. Right. All right.
Hello. George, you need to turn on your
I will. Hang on just a second. Let's see. Start. Should be working. Is it okay now?
Your mute button.
Yeah.
You can figure it out while I talk.
There we go. How's that?
That's better.
I can still hear you, but yeah, we can hear you. Good. For example, parish administrators are very aware that right now directors of communication are working way overtime. I mean, ours here in Jacksonville seems to be working 24 hours a day, videotaping, live streaming, working out Zoom meetings, etc. She's way overworked right now. So the dean and I have already talked about giving her a quiet bonus, for example, at the end of April. She doesn't know that yet. I'm just suggesting that's one of the things we could consider, because some people are overwhelmed right now. Other people need to be repurposed. Next is there could be a flare-up in the staff. We haven't had any here in Jacksonville yet, but it could happen anytime where one staff really is getting after another staff member. And I would suggest, as we would anytime during the year, normal times, to have a Zoom meeting at that stage, really address whatever the issue is. Don't let it simmer. Don't try to deny that it's not happening. Really get after it with a good spirit and try to build back whatever relationship has been damaged. Tend to the staff, esprit de corps, in other words. Two more things I'll mention is one is to encourage, I've encouraged all of our staff here at St. John's Cathedral to have 2 or 3 best practice colleagues, especially during this pandemic. I had already asked them to do that, but now I'm really emphasizing that they stay in touch with 2 or 3 best practice colleagues who are in other congregations or other dioceses or in other organizations that they trust, at least once a week, to stay in touch with those people, to ask them, how are things going with you? What are you learning? What things have you tried that worked, etc. We all need to be in a learning, teaching mode as we discover how to be the church in the middle of these new realities. And of course, last, which could be first, is to practice a devotional life together. It's important, I believe, especially now, to pray together, to have a spiritual connection with each other. I know some of your staffs, maybe the staff member is of another faith tradition or of another denomination. Do that in the way that's good for your staff. But I think it's very important these days to have a devotional life together, possibly even to have prayer partners. We haven't done that here yet at St. John's, but we're considering that we'll do that, where people will pray for each other and know who each other's partner is, even as we pray together when we have our Zoom meeting. And tomorrow, I'll add on one more thing. Tomorrow, the dean and I are sending care packages to all of our staff members. We're sending fresh fruit. We're sending a nice note from the dean and me. We're sending them a couple funny books, one interesting book by Rowan Williams. We're sending them some, in other words, to send it to their home where it's fairly safe, to say, the dean and I count you as very valuable. We hope you're okay at home working. And here's a care package, almost like you'd send your college kid, when they're away and feeling lonely. So those are some of the things that we are doing or want to do here at the cathedral. And some of those are very obvious to all of you, but some of them may be ideas that you might want to try on in your congregation. I'd welcome any ideas that you've done in your congregation in terms of caring for your staff that have not mentioned. So that's enough from me to start off the pastoral conversation.
Well, thank you, Bob, for sharing that, for your thoughts and consideration of our staff and our parishes. Some really good ideas there. And for now would be a great time if anyone has any thoughts or things that they're doing that they'd like to share. We do have a chat that's open. We're also collecting questions for the end of this webinar. So if you want to post those there, I will paste them into our Q&A portion. So thank you, Father Bob. To continue this discussion, I'm going to invite Joni Huerta. She's the Executive Director of Human Resources at St. Martin's Episcopal Church, and St. Martin's Episcopal Preschool and the Hope and Healing Center and Institute in Houston, Texas, to share with us about the HR perspective and kind of continue that consideration of our staff. So Joni, take it away.
Yeah, Zach, thank you very much for inviting me back. It's certainly a privilege to speak with a lot of folks who are really my peers out there. I think there are 4 things that really have resonated in the work that we've done over the last week and as we look to the weeks to come. And the essence of them are making sure that your essential employees have what they need if they need to be present on campus to do their work. Analyzing data to go after any funds that we can to keep employees employed, administering the FFCPA, and then communication, like Bob was talking about, it's just such an important component, and we in HR can be, feeding that process and really making sure that it is partnering with a communications director if you have one for both internal and external communication. So what I'd like to touch on with essential employees is just that, there are a lot of conversations and questions around who are essential employees and who can go to work if they must. And I'll tell you what we've done. Again, I always like to be careful to say, talk to your chancellor, make sure things are okay on that end before you pursue any of the recommendations that I offer that kind of touch in that area of overlap with the legal team. But what we did early on was we identified who our essential employees were who might have to have campus access. And then we looked at what our judge here in Harris County, Houston, said in the governor's guidance, and they referenced a document that was written by Director Christopher Krebs, who's part of Homeland Security. And that document identifies, 17 or so functions, but within the actual memo, there's a great deal of flexibility that goes beyond those 17 core areas. And it makes sure that you can get on campus to pay bills, to pay people, to process incoming checks. And so what we did was we wrote letters for each of our essential employees, identifying, so that they could carry something around, just giving them perhaps a little bit of comfort that if they must go on campus, even though it's not ideal, that they have that reassurance in doing that. And specifically, we're talking about communications director or folks who are paying bills or virtual services, these kinds of necessary items. So that's where essential employees come in. From an analyzing compensation data perspective, let me tell you, like many of you, we've been doing a whole lot of work. And it's really on two fronts. One is going after whatever we can in terms of grants. Grants come first. So I'm going to say that under the CARES Act, you've probably already heard about it, the Paycheck Protection Program loan, one component of that, the PPPL. And what that really does is, as you may already know, what it does is it allows you to request a loan through your banker, which if you meet certain terms, for example, you keep your employees employed or rehire them in a given time period, and you don't make wage cuts that are deeper than, say, 25%, you can actually get loan forgiveness as much as in full on that. And so from an HR standpoint, it's analyzing the compensation data over the past year, annualizing it, taking 2.5%, and then looking at, do we want to request, 2.5 months worth of your average payroll, and then saying, do we really want to request that whole amount? The reason I'm saying that is because there's a difference between what you can request and the loan forgiveness. And if I were you, what I'd do is I'd take a careful look at the 2.5 months worth that you can request, up to a certain cap of 10 million or have you. I don't know that many of us will reach that, and the amount of loan forgiveness, what it can be forgiven off of. And so really working with your finance team to understand that. The other piece on grants that I think is important to go after is talk to your diocese. I know that what we're asking for is assistance with what we call an outreach assessment. Since St. Martin's, our organization does so much on its own in terms of outreach. We're saying, hey, since we're doing parallel efforts, can you give us any grace on that, the diocesan assessment? And they're being very generous to work with us. And then the third piece under grants is not too much in terms of grants. I mean, I guess I'm using that name quite liberally, but it's really working with your bishop to see if your congregation might qualify for CPG's clergy pension assessment. Where loans are concerned, the real question is, do I want to kick the can down the road, or am I concerned, like we are here in Houston, where oil and gas and that economy directly affects, many of our parishioners, do we really want to go in that direction? If we do, there are things that we can consider. So for example, you can consider, based upon the guidance we've received, the Social Security deferment under the CARES Act. Some things under the CARES Act rule each other out. If you go for one, you can't get them all. But it looks like that might be a function if we wanted to go down that loan path. Certainly for small businesses, the EIDL, that's the Economic Injury and Disaster Loan, is something that you can pursue. The key there is you just can't double dip. So you can't go and use the PPP loan against the EIDL loan, but all of that requires this compensation data and being able to justify your expenses on the back end. So the third item is really administering the FFCPA. That's the Coronavirus, Families First Coronavirus Protection Act. I'll tell you, that one's kind of come with some interesting findings. Well, let me just give you a premise first. First of all, remember, you're supposed to have posted any posters by April 1st that relate to how the FFCPA works. So make sure you've done that. Make sure that you are, one of the things that we did was we got out ahead, and when we heard that somebody on one of our staff might have, was getting tested for the virus, we were very transparent. We were very, we treated it with, in a very discreet manner in terms of, identifying the individual, but it allowed us the liberty to say, hey, this is going to go on. Here's how we want you to respond when this happens with a fellow employee, grace and with a lot of grace. But it's also, let us know so that we can help to take a look and see if you might qualify for a provision under that act. So it was a good opportunity to communicate in terms of that. What we're doing there is we're keeping a log so that we've identified folks and they know that our goal is to keep a log so that if somebody has been on campus in a short period of time, we have an opportunity to turn around and they know ahead of time that we're going to want to do what, the public health administrators ask us to do by informing people that they may have come in contact with within the period of exposure, if that's the case. It's becoming more and more slim now that we've been closed for several weeks now as a campus, but it was still using that first example gave us the leverage to set up a process and give people some comfort around how to come forward and self-disclose. And it's been useful. The other thing on administering the FFCPA is keeping in mind that you've got a whole set of time and labor and payroll practices to set up. You need to customize your codes with regard to setting up something that's specific to the FFCPA, the Act's sick and paid leave provision. And really make sure you understand how this stuff works, because, for example, you want to know how tax credits are applied. If you have a payroll company that you work with, do they do it for you? Do you have to do something? You also want to know things like if you pay under one kind of the Act, it pays 2/3 automatically. So if you're working with a payroll provider and you want to pay somebody more than 2/3, particularly if you need to have compliance under the CARES Act with the PPP loan, you need to understand the mechanisms so that you don't, set up somebody or have your payroll provider paying them at 2/3 when maybe you need to be paying them at a higher wage. So make sure you understand those nuances. And one of the things that we found was we thought we were going to go right out the gate and that this was going to be something we were going to start administering right away. And then the more and more we read and hear from chancellors, we find that no, in fact, shelter in place provisions don't generally trigger the FFCPA sick time. And so that's been interesting because we are ready to go, but we have a shelter in place, so it doesn't necessarily coincide. The very last thing worth talking about is just communication. Again, to what Father Bob said, being as transparent as you can be, sharing with them, the reality of the situation, and yet how leadership is stepping up to really go after these different components to assist, to make sure that, if at all possible, we can keep folks on is really important. Also then sharing a letter that I'll put out this week will be a reminder about all of the short-term disability benefits that through CPG. It'll be a reminder to folks about some of the TIAA provisions, that changes as it relates to retirement. We'll be updating folks about, reminding them about EAP. We'll be talking to them about CPGs, some of the other things that Lori's going to be sharing with you. And then getting into some of the details about what the CARES Act says and the allowances it makes for things like pension withdrawal under certain circumstances. And even, this has changed since the last time we spoke, some of the unemployment options that they can pass along, hopefully just to family members, that federal law now appears to permit churches as well and nonprofit organizations to participate in. So that's a whole lot of information. I hope you got something out of it. Can certainly learn from you guys too in terms of what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Joni, for sharing how we can keep our staff informed and what we can do for them, especially as it relates to the two new pieces of policy that are being enacted in response to COVID-19. I'm really looking forward to our next two speakers kind of digging into those. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm already getting a few questions, so I am copying those into the Q&A portion, and we will address as many of those as we can. I've asked our speakers to stay on as long as they can this morning to answer questions, so we'll look forward to sharing some answers later on in the call. Our next speaker, Lori Casalonis, is the Senior Vice President of Church Pension Group in New York, New York. And she's going to speak to us about CPG's offerings at this time and the actionable things that we can do.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Zach. And Joni, that was amazing. I can't believe how much you crammed into that short period of time that you talked to us. So it's great to be with you all after 2 very busy weeks. I want to express how amazing it has been to watch the Episcopal Church in action during this crisis. You have all been extraordinary. At CPG, we've been continuing to evaluate how we can help within the context of our mission and our fiduciary obligations to maintain the long-term health of the fund. When we last talked, Mary Kate was about to announce some ways that CPG could support the church during some difficult times. On Sunday, March 22nd, we emailed all Episcopal Church diocesan bishops to explain a program that Joni just mentioned, by which diocesan bishops can request a 2-month hardship clergy pension waiver for congregations that don't have resources to pay their assessments. On Monday, the 23rd of March, we shared this program pretty widely. I think the email list was about 30,000. Just to give you a quick highlight, the diocesan bishops must certify that there is a declared emergency, that it has severely impacted the congregation, and that there are inadequate resources, including endowments, within that affected congregation to pay the assessments and continue to function. To let you know, we've been in conversation with a number of diocesan bishops who are carefully evaluating each congregation, and applications are starting to come in. These waivers are, in essence, Church Pension Fund paying the cleric's assessment for those 2 months. It's not a deferral. The clergy will receive their credited service and the congregation will see a credit on their future bill. These monies are not unlimited, so we're very grateful for the careful evaluation that each diocesan bishop is putting into their application consideration. Next, a reminder, we mentioned this the last time we spoke, that the Medical Trust is waiving all copays and deductibles and coinsurance for COVID testing to be compliant with the Families First Coronavirus Act. But in addition, the Medical Trust is also waiving copays, deductibles, network coinsurance for active members for healthcare treatment related to COVID. The summaries of benefits have been updated and they are on our website. Last week, we also announced a 90-day extension on benefit and property insurance payments. We've gotten a lot of questions about that. So what does that mean? What it means is that all benefits and products through the church pension group, health, dental, pension, life, property and casualty, we're basically extending 90 days beyond our typical due date. And also in response to the concerns around the church, you all are unable to get into your parishes, you may be unable to pay bills. We just want to make sure everyone knows that there will be no cancellations processed for April, May, and June. Just none. So feel confident that your coverage will remain intact during that period of time. So after that, 90 days will be tacked on to the normal due date. Just to give you a little bit of education, both the medical trust and the church insurance property plans are self-funded programs dedicated to the Episcopal Church. Each plan has reasonable and adequate reserves. However, we don't have unlimited reserves. So we're hopeful that those church entities with the ability to pay their bills, or either part or in full, will continue to do so, as we will continue to pay out health plan claims and property insurance claims during this period. We're all in this together, and CPG is doing our part to help you all get through this. Another important announcement from the Medical Trust is, effective immediately, the Medical Trust will allow claims for virtual provider appointments, and we will waive all member costs for health plan telehealth services for the rest of the year. So what does that mean? Lots of people are like, well, what does that mean? We speak the lingo, you probably don't. Virtual provider appointments means that if you were typically going to go to a physician, and that provider appointment can be done virtually, either via Zoom or FaceTime or something, we will submit that claim can be submitted and processed as a regular appointment, which is not something that could happen in the past. Telehealth is basically telemedicine. So Cigna's Amwell or MD Live or Anthem's Live Health Online, those are telemedicine services that were already in place that had a copay. Those can be done absolutely without copay. So those copays are all waived. And the hope there, obviously, is that we can keep you all well and healthy without having to go anywhere and maintain all of our social distancing. Joni mentioned the CARES Act. On last Thursday afternoon, we began to get requests from parishes who needed some help gathering the data that they needed around what they're paying for benefits. And the team at CPG, some of my colleagues, have done amazing work to figure out a way to prepare some annual statements for you all. I'm thinking that by the middle of the week, you will be able to call our client services area and get a comprehensive report of what your employer paid us for benefits during 2019 and year-to-date 2020. So that's a resource that hopefully will be helpful for some of you. Joni mentioned disability. Our Zurich program has been extended a bit so that the 14-day quarantine period, if someone does get sick with COVID, can be part of their what's the word I want? Elimination period. So if you have someone in that situation, please call Zurich. They're fully engaged with what we're doing. And if you have someone who is diagnosed, call Zurich with regard to your disability insurance. I also want to remind you that Church Publishing continues to add free downloads in English and in Spanish to our website. There's a compilation of daily Holy Week activities for you all to use between Palm Sunday and Easter. We have free shipping using the code FREESHIP. And don't forget the Employee Assistance Program. The Employee Assistance Program has emotional and family support, just all kinds of resources out there for your members to use. This is a hard time. Father Bob talked about how you can support your employees during this time, but anyone on the EAP can call and get some resources. I had a conversation with a woman who's my mentee at CPG, and we work at Church Pension Group. She has coverage from the Medical Trust, and she was talking about how stressed she is. Her brother is sick, her parents might be sick, and I mentioned the EAP to her, and she just said, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And we work at Church Pension Group. So I do hope that you will continue to offer that up as a resource for your folks. And just one more reminder, this is a scary financial time. We have certified financial planners standing by. One speaks fluent Spanish. Please encourage your people to call and make an appointment to talk to someone about the financial challenges right now. And we're here to help. So call if you need us. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks, Lori, for sharing all that information. And it's really encouraging to know that at this time that CPG is really leading the way and has our backs. I think I can speak for all the administrators in our appreciation for what you all are doing right now. Our next speaker is George Plews, and I believe that Todd Raylew is in the background there. They are
around shortly.
okay.
Appropriate social distancing.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. They are partners at Plews, Shadley, and Ratcher and Braun, LLP, in Indianapolis, Indiana. And they're going to share with us the legal perspective, especially as it relates to the CARES Act and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It seems like we're all having trouble saying that.
That is, just say the CARES Act. That's good. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm George Plews. I'm also the Chancellor of SEEP, and I'm the Chancellor of the Diocese of Indianapolis. And Todd is the Assistant Chancellor and Chancellor of Trinity Episcopal Church, and also Junior Warden of Trinity, one of the member parishes. And we're going to try and, but the first, if not the main takeaway this morning, is you get to use your chancellors. This is a time that everybody wants to step up. We are getting, as a diocesan chancellor, I think I get about 30 emails a day from other chancellors around the country, from the Chancellor of the Episcopal Church, sharing information that would be very valuable to have, summaries of these new legislation, ideas, kicking back and forth, all kinds of suggestions. So the first thing is don't hesitate to reach out to chancellors at the time when they really want to come through. Todd's going to take you through the nuances of the CARES Act, which we've already been talking about. But I wanted to put a quick pitch in for looking at your insurance coverage too. Look at it for potential applications during this time. The property insurance that you have, business interruption, event cancellation. There are all kinds of coverages that may have application. They may not, but that's a matter of state law, and you need to look at that and make sure your parishioners, also those that are struggling, you can make that suggestion to them too, that they should look at that coverage for help and protection. And business interruption coverage, for example, we're prosecuting a number of claims right now for that. But the main topic this morning, I think, is the CARES Act. And I'll let Todd, who's been looking at that both for our firm as well as for all our clients. So he's become quite knowledgeable on this. So Todd, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, George. I'll give a brief overview of some of the relevant provisions under the CARES Act that I think are most applicable to churches and churches who are members of SEEP. You know, obviously the largest element under the CARES Act that has drawn the most attention is the Paycheck Protection Program loans. As many of you guys have heard, as Joni alluded to earlier, those loans are available through the Small Business Administration. Typically, as everyone knows, churches, other religious organizations are not eligible. They are for these loans. It's whether or not you have, and many of the churches in SEEP have, I'm sure, received 501c3 determination letters. The SBA has come out with guidance that even if there are churches that have not received their determination letters, if they would otherwise qualify as 501c3 organizations, they are also qualifying for loans, both payroll protection program loans and
It's hard for them to hear you.
all right, let me switch over there. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So under the Paycheck Protection Program loans, as Joni had alluded to, those are available for churches, even though Small Business Administration loans wouldn't normally be. The amount of the loan that you can apply for is 2.5 times your payroll, which includes not only wages, salaries, but also some other things like sick leave and vacation benefits, similar benefits to that. It is capped at $100,000 per employee. So there's a calculation in there as to sort of what your maximum loan amount is going to be. I do agree with Joni that you should look at the amount that you're going to apply for. You should also keep in mind that you only have one shot at this. There's only one loan that you can take out under the program. So the guidance from Treasury, which you can choose to follow or ignore, is to take out the maximum loan amount. although it does also, cut you out from other programs that I'll talk about briefly. The idea here is that then once you get this loan, in the next 8 weeks, you're going to spend it primarily on payroll. The guidance now is that you have to use 75, if you want full forgiveness, you have to use 75% of the loan at least on payroll. And then the other 25% could be for rent, mortgage interest, interest on other debts that you've incurred before February 15th, things like that. Utilities. Yeah, utilities would be the other category. Some other facts about the loans, maybe you guys have seen, there's a lot of guidance out there that reflects the language in the statute itself, which talks about sort of a loan of up to 10 years, up to 4%. The guidance that's out there now from Treasury is that all loans will be at 1%. It'll be over a period of 2 years. Payments deferrable up to 6 months. So that's true on all loans there under the Paycheck Protection Program. And then, as Joni also alluded to, if you do eliminate full-time employee equivalents during this period, and there are 2 periods of comparison. You can either compare it to the same period, essentially from last year, or you can compare it to the early part of this year. But if you're eliminating full-time employee equivalents during that period, your percentage of forgiveness ratchets down depending on how many people you eliminate versus how many people you employ. So some of that won't be forgivable. Again, it's loan at 1% interest, so that's fairly generous. Some interesting additional elements on that, and this applies to any sort of federal assistance that churches are getting. We did finally get some clarification on Friday that churches are 100% eligible for this. We all suspected that would be the case, but we didn't get confirmation until Friday. Interestingly, for any time that you are taking federal assistance, non-discrimination obligations do apply. What follows in the guidance is 2 paragraphs of, I don't know, the sort of, we don't, essentially Treasury declaring we don't know exactly what that means, and we're not going to restrict your religious freedom, but be aware that there are some non-discrimination obligations that will apply if you take such a loan, at least for the period until you repay the loan. Let's see, what else? If you do not take a payroll protection program loan, you can be eligible for an employee retention credit. So if you retain employees, you can then have 50% of their qualified wages paid for each quarter after March. You can get a tax credit on that. So basically, the way that the math works out, it's a maximum of $5,000 per employee that you retain throughout this period. And the only other limitation that applies there is if your gross receipts are at least 80% of what you made during that quarter last year, you can't count the payments that you make to employees during that quarter. So most people that, and most churches that will qualify for Paycheck Protection Program loans will just proceed in that route. But if you don't take out a Paycheck Protection Program loan, you certainly should look at the employee retention credit and see if that would be of benefit to you, depending on how badly hurt you are by COVID-19. For any churches above 500 employees, so the Paycheck Protection Program is for small businesses, and churches under 500 employees. For those between 500 and 10,000, there's economic stabilization loans that are available at a low interest rate of 2%, but there's no loan forgiveness on that. So that's obviously a less attractive program. Other than that, the CARES Act also expanded who's eligible for unemployment assistance. So normally church employees would not be eligible for unemployment assistance. They are under the CARES Act so long as their position was eliminated in some way, and there's several categories or several reasons why. They just have to certify that they essentially lost their job in connection with coronavirus in some way. So there's that. The other small element is that I'm sure many of you have already heard that there's been expansion of incentives for charitable contributions. So there's an above the line deduction for up to $300 of donations. And then there's been an easing of the limitations on the deductibility of charitable contributions overall by companies and individuals.
Also pension relief, a little bit of pension
Right,
relief.
a little bit of pension relief built in there as well.
allows folks to take distributions without penalty in certain circumstances. So if you have older employees that may be eligible to take or required to take IRA or other distributions, they can do that. The rules for that are too complicated to explain in 5 minutes, so we'll do that another
Right.
time.
Yeah. And then the only other thing that I'll mention is under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the main thing that it seems to apply to churches are the paid leave provisions, which Joni had already spoken about. So that's really the element there that is of most interest to churches.
There are a couple of questions I saw on the question board on the side there.
Yeah, we're gonna bounce back to those questions in the Q&A portion. I want to make sure we have time to listen to Sean Ryan's perspective from Trinity Church in New York. Thank you, Todd and George, for sharing all of that information and clarification about the CARES Act. I know it's very helpful for us to know how those things play out, especially the loans and the paycheck protection. So we received several questions. We're going to continue to collect those in the chat box. And with that, we're going to shift to Sean Ryan. Sean Ryan is the Director of Safety and Security at Trinity Church in New York City, New York. Sean also has a very interesting background that I hope you'll touch on at the very beginning to kind of share a unique perspective on this. And with that, I'm just going to invite Sean to take it away.
Sure. Good morning. Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm not sure what my colleague told you about my background, but I came to Trinity in this past August. I came from the New York State Metropolitan Transportation Authority. I was Chief Security Officer there. And before that, I was at the New York City Housing Authority. So I've been in the public sector for quite a while. I'm very happy to be at Trinity Church Wall Street in New York City for the past few months, which have turned out to be pretty exciting. So my portfolio is safety, security, and emergency management. And my mission when I started here was to put together a formalized safety, security, emergency management program. We had some security elements in place, and my strategy is to build a comprehensive program. So pandemic response, believe it or not, is in that portfolio. It just wasn't at the top when we started to put it together. I thought what I would do, I don't really have a formal presentation for you. I thought what I would do is go through some of the milestones that we went through at Trinity as this thing evolved, talk about some of the basic planning principles that we use, excuse me, and then some of the actions that we've taken in response to that. In terms of the milestones, we had, when the COVID-19 began to emerge in February, the way it got on our radar early was we had some travel planned, first to Barbados and then Tanzania for business and a few other things. And we had to make a decision about those travel arrangements. The first was Barbados. There were not any cases even in the hemisphere when this happened. And we decided to cancel the Barbados trip in February, and then in early March, the Tanzania trip. And I want to talk about the decision-making framework for that, because that's sort of our security and safety decision-making framework. I'll come back to that. On the, that was the 28th of February and the 3rd of March. On the 4th of March, we formed an emergency management task force, senior leaders in the organization to come together and meet and plan our response to the what was then an epidemic, primarily in China. That was the 4th. By the 12th of March, Thursday, we made a decision to close all of our churches and offices and other properties around New York City. We have a retreat center in Connecticut as well. So the 13th of March was our first day working remotely. Today is the 24th. That decision-making process is what I call a look-back view. Right? There's no way to make a perfect decision with these things. There's no way to anticipate how it's going to develop, where it will develop, what's the right decision, what's the wrong decision. There's just no way to optimize that. So the idea is to make the lowest regret error possible. And I think our lens on the 13th, when we made a decision about closing, was looked something like this. Nobody wanted to close, and certainly no one wants to close the churches. And just for background, so we operate Trinity Church on Broadway and Wall Street in New York City, St. Paul's Chapel on Broadway and Fulton Street in New York City. We have a 27-story office with community center. We don't have commercial tenants yet, but our staff offices are there. We have a retreat center in Connecticut, a preschool in Lower Manhattan. So a lot of things there. And again, no, you know, we were reluctant to close them. And so the process was something like this. We thought if we stayed open, if we closed, let me start again. If we closed and nothing happened, and the epidemic, I don't think it was a pandemic yet, and the epidemic stopped dead immediately the next day, we would have been closed for a few days. We would have had pretty minimal impact, and we would have been doing so in good faith and in accordance with what was then guidance, not a mandatory order, what was then guidance from the state of New York. That was the best case scenario, wrong decision. If we didn't close and the worst case scenario happened, which it turned out to, we likely would have been a vector for community transmission in New York City, which nobody wanted to do, and without being melodramatic, certainly contributed to sickness and fatalities in New York City. And the sort of the middle road option there was if we didn't close and still the virus spread in New York City, but we had no negative effects, that would have just been pure luck. And luck is not a good planning strategy. So we took what we thought was the lowest regret error and decided to close. And that turned out to absolutely be the right decision, I think. And then not long after that, we were ordered by the governor of New York, of course, to close all houses of worship, non-essential businesses, and non-essential personnel got a stay-at-home order. That's sort of the decision-making lens for most safety and security decisions, I think. So the way we are operating in this environment is, and I think, and Joni mentioned this, covered this pretty well. Obviously, we want to have the minimum amount of staff possible in our buildings, exposed to the virus out in public in New York City. So for us, that means clergy and minor support staff in Trinity Church, where we're doing streaming online services, which has been very well received. We keep a building engineer, fire safety director in our office building, fire watch in St. Paul's Chapel, and when we're not doing the service in Trinity Church, a fire watch and one security guard, and we have one security guard sort of supervisor 24/7 doing a roving patrol. Ironically, it's easier to provide physical security for those sites when they're closed and there are no staff there and no congregation coming to visit us. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but so my primary concern shifts from what it normally is to, believe it or not, to fire safety. So the places are not occupied, and we're very concerned about fire safety. I don't have to tell everyone the history of that. So we have 24/7 fire watch in every location and a full-time fire safety director. And I apologize if I'm telling you something, you know, in New York City, this is a very tightly regulated thing and requires a licensed fire safety director licensed by the fire department. Let me see. The main thing beyond that is the way we protect our staff. So we try to protect three things: our people, our operations, and our assets. Our operations are what they are at the moment. Our assets are easy to protect physically, as I said. Our people, our staff, our congregation, and so forth are another thing. So the way we're protecting them is by rigorous adherence to the non-essential staff order and to social distancing guidelines. We keep absolute minimal staff in the office. Again, I think Joni touched on this. We have some one building engineer checks on building systems every day, minimal security guard staff. Once in a while, an IT person needs to go in to change tapes or something like that. Once in a while, an AV person needs to go in to support our streaming operation. But that's it. Other than that, we've taken a very conservative approach to this. And I think I think that was a good decision for us to make early on, and obviously continues to be. Finally, those staff who do go in, we're paying very close attention to them to make sure that we minimize their exposure. So the security staff in particular, they're there around the clock. We make sure that they get meals. Right now it's nearly impossible to find a meal in Lower Manhattan, if you could believe that. So we make sure we get food to them. We make sure to monitor their health, make sure that they don't feel ill, make sure that they don't live in a high vulnerability environment with maybe elderly family members or family members who are sick or particularly vulnerable. And if they are, we take them off the rotation and take care of them that way as well. So.
Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing that perspective and what we should be paying attention to as administrators. And as well, I think one of the things that you touched on that's really valuable is creating that framework for decision making, especially as this continues to change. Having a seat at the table as an administrator with your leadership is a key in making the right decisions. The ones that produce the least regret, I suppose, is the way that you framed it. So that was very helpful.
Low regret errors. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that, we're going to move on. We're running just a bit over time, but we do have several questions from the chat box for the Q&A, and I'll continue to keep an eye on that. These will be for all of the panelists, so feel free to chime in as we touch on an area that you specialize in. The first
Zach,
question.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can I say I'm going to have to drop off for another call, but I'd be happy to follow up with any questions or comments offline. Please feel free to give my email out or whatever is necessary.
All right, thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Sean.
Bye.
The first question is, the vestry has to make a certain certification when applying for payroll protection. One is ongoing loss of business operations due to economic conditions. Can most endowed parishes make that certification, and should we?
Yes, this is Todd Rowley. So the certification that I've seen required for the form loan application that was put out by the Department of Treasury, and the one that I've seen from particular lenders that we've engaged with, talks about the effect of economic uncertainty and how that affects sort of future operations, which is, I think, broader than at least what's being represented here. So I'm not sure if there's another form out there that they're looking at, but I think sort of the economic uncertainty around it provides sort of a broader angle sort of to look at this, and none of us know kind of where this is going. I haven't seen any guidance anywhere from Treasury or anywhere else suggesting that endowed parishes need to substantially spend down their endowment as they experience losses in this market. Many of our endowments are way down because of that. There's a lot of economic uncertainty surrounding that. If I were, for the church that I'm the junior warden of, if I were asked to sign a certification related to economic uncertainty affecting the church and its eligibility for a PPP loan, I would be willing to sign that certification. I think we are justified, given all the unknowns that are out there and given the market hits that many of us have taken. I think that these churches would qualify.
Remember too, it can free up resources for us that otherwise would be pulling back to keep your people on staff. So, and that's you don't have to use the loan. Once you get it, you can pay it back if you want to. You don't have to have the forgiveness. So there's a lot of, and the key thing, or a key thing to remember, and this is my economist part of me saying, we've got to get as many dollars as we can out into the economy generally. And that means using resources like this at a time like this.
Thank you. Did anyone have any other thoughts they wanted to share for that question? We can move right on to the next question. The next question is there any way we could get a copy of the communication, not to reproduce, but for informational purposes? I think this was related to Joni's communication that she's sending out.
Yeah, I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was in reference to the essential employee letter we've created. And we'd be glad to provide that to SEEP later today so that they have a copy of it.
Thanks, Joni. The next question is for the CPG waiver of clergy assessments. One of the things the bishops needs to check is that there is an inadequate resource, that there are inadequate resources, including endowments, within the affected congregation and diocese to pay assessments and continue to function. So I think this is a question for Lori. The wording is confusing. For a parish to apply, does the diocesan endowment need to be emptied first?
That was worded very intentionally for the bishop to use their judgment. Truthfully, we're not really opining on that. It's for the bishop to carefully consider. I don't think we're saying you have to to buy down your entire endowment, but there needs to be a thoughtful consideration about the fact that funds are not unlimited. It's unlimited at CPG either, but we do want to help the church. So we left this completely in the bishop's hands to think about how they're going to balance all of the factors that are happening right now, and it's in the bishop's hand. Does that help?
I think that is. It sounds like it's an interpretation. I've received several questions between this and the next one about when the recording will be available. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and Joe will message me if I am, that the recording will be available on the SEEP website later this week. Several of you asked that. Yes, it will certainly be available for your reference. I know there was a lot of information shared in a very short period of time, so I personally will look forward to reviewing that as well. The next question is, in regard to payroll protection, has anyone been able to determine whether clergy housing allowance is allowed to be included in the calculation of payroll totals?
So I listened to a webinar from the ECFA earlier this week, and the lawyers on that call interpreted it to say that the housing allowance can be included in that payroll cost. I'd be interested to know what our chancellor on the phone on the webinar here thinks as well.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, we agree. We agree.
That's great. I'm sure for whoever asked that question, that's going to be a very valuable answer. The next question is, does Live Health offer $0 copays for psychology, psychiatry, and allergy virtual visits as well? And I think that's for Lori. Lori, you're there.
Sorry, I had to get to my mute. Can you repeat that question, Zach?
The question is, does Live Health offer $0 copays for psychology, psychiatry, and allergy virtual visits as well?
Well, the EAP is $0 copay. So for behavioral health, for those kinds of psychiatry, it would be going through the EAP. Live Health, I think they're mostly medical, and I apologize, I don't know the answer to this question. I think most of the Live Health is much more around primary care. You know, you're feeling like you have an earache or a sore throat. Those are the kind of things that can happen. But we are paying for virtual visits with specialists. So when I mentioned that virtual visits can be paid similarly to a regular visit, there's still a copay associated with it, but they can go to their specialist as long as their specialist can have that visit remotely. So it means they don't have to go out.
Great. And if someone has a specific question, how do they find an answer with CPG? What's the best course of action?
They can call our client services area, but with regard to their benefits eligibility, I'd really recommend that they turn their medical card over and call the client services number on the back of the card. We're working really closely with Cigna and Anthem and Kaiser, and most of what we're doing is just in lockstep with what the providers are doing anyway, but they can call, and the client services folks who are dedicated to the medical trust can answer those specific questions.
Thanks, Lori. The next question, I'm not sure if we'll have an answer for this on the call, but I'll be interested to hear perspectives. The question is, for what purposes are churches using the EIDL? It sounded like the purpose, well, I'll just let the panelists cover that.
So I've not worked with any churches who, oh, go ahead, Joni.
I was just going to say, for something other than the payroll cost, so that we don't duplicate with the PPP loan. But it was going to be just that brief. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've not worked with any churches who have taken out any ideal loan. As written, I agree with Joni that there's substantial overlap. I mean, the idea there is that it's being used for payroll and other operating costs. So, I mean, it could be other things, like what we covered.
Yeah.
It can even be accounts receivable costs. So if you just pull it up on the Small Business Association, it'll give a list. The key is just not duplicating one with the other.
Thank you. That was actually what I was going to say. So the next question is, we were told by the Chancellor of the Diocese of Ohio that housing allowance are not to be included. This info came from the webinar with the senator from Georgia, this person believes. He wrote part of the bill. They're saying look into this further before proceeding. Are there any thoughts from our attorneys regarding that information?
Yeah. The question was that apparently there is guidance out there from
The Diocese of Ohio.
Ohio that housing allowances are not to be included. That's the first I've seen of any of it.
Contrary to what I've heard,
Yeah, I think the majority of what we've heard has gone the other way on that, and that housing allowances are to be included.
They use a broad definition of benefits to include everything like vacation, sick time, all kinds of other things that are included in that computation of what your payroll has been.
Todd, would you mind summarizing that? I'm not sure if that came through.
Oh,
very
sure.
clearly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from the guidance that we have that's out there, there's a very broad definition of benefits that has been adopted, obviously, to include vacation time and a lot of other things. Now, it doesn't specifically say clergy housing allowance in there because it's a fairly specific category, but it's still based on the guidance that we have. We believe that it's included. You know, I mean, there's more guidance coming out all the time, so
that's consistent with the broad definition of benefits that are counted anyway.
Yeah, right. So it's consistent with the broad definition of benefits that appears to be present in the law and the regulations.
I think we're receiving more discussion about this on the chat box. I think the strong suggestion would be to speak with your chancellor about what their interpretation may be regarding this, as there is always new information coming out. With that, we are coming to the close of our chat questions. I know that Joe has just posted information related to where the recorded materials will be, so please take a look at that before you sign off today. And I would like to thank all of our panelists today, Joni, Lori, Bob, George, and Todd, as well as Sean, who had to sign off early. If Bob will be comfortable leading us out in prayer, I would be most appreciative. And Bob, you are on mute.
Parish administrators, as a priest for a long time in parishes, you are a very important person right now to your dean and to your rector. And I want to thank you for all the ways that you're serving our church and advancing all of our mission. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Oh God, thank you for our parish administrators and all the ways that they exercise their gifts and talents to advance the mission of the church. Be with all of us in the midst of these new details and realities, that we may negotiate them with dexterity and grace, and then finally give us a sense of your purpose and presence as we continue to deal with these unfolding realities. We do pray for healing of our globe, of our planet, and in the middle of that also the healing of our people. Give us a great sense of peace this day, that what we do is important and significant. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of our attendees for tuning in this morning. We will have more of these webinars available. So thank you for joining this one, and please tune in to the ceepnetwork.org website for more of these webinars and resources as we navigate this interesting time we're living in. With that, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
Adios.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Zach.